The auctioneer was about to bring down his gavel on lot number 17 when Jeremiah Stone rose from the back of the crowd, walked calmly to the auction platform, and set the entire ledger book ablaze with a match struck against his boot heel. As the flames consumed page after page of human transactions, the young Lakota woman, chained to the post behind the auctioneer, looked directly at Jeremiah with eyes that held no hope, no fear, only the terrible acceptance of someone who had watched. Her entire world burned before this moment. "That book," Jeremiah announced to the shocked crowd of bidders and traders, contained the names of over 300 people sold like cattle in this valley, and I'll be damned if I let one more name get added to it. What happened next would tear apart everything the town of Bitter Creek thought it knew about law, order, and the price of human dignity. But to understand how an old rancher's act of defiance sparked a revolution that changed the entire territory, I need to tell you about the day Jeremiah Stone decided that some things were worth burning the world down to stop. Jeremiah had come to Bitter Creek, Wyoming, in 1885, with no intention of attending what the local merchants euphemistically called a labor acquisition fair. At 62, he'd been ranching in the territory for 30 years, building a modest but successful operation through honest work and fair dealing with everyone from fellow ranchers to the native tribes whose traditional hunting grounds bordered his property. But his foreman, a young man named Henry Walsh, had convinced him to come to town to bid on what Henry called legitimate indentured servants who could help with the harvest season that was overwhelming their small crew. "It's all legal, Mr. Stone," Henry had assured him as they rode toward town. "These are people who've signed contracts willingly, trading their labor for transportation and lodging. The territorial government oversees the whole operation." Jeremiah had been skeptical, but Henry was young and enthusiastic, and the ranch did need help during harvest season. So he'd agreed to come to town and see what kind of workers might be available for hire. What he found when they arrived at the town square made him feel sick to his stomach. A wooden platform had been erected in front of the general store, with iron posts driven into the planks at regular intervals. Chained to these posts were 23 people, ranging in age from what looked like 15 to 50, representing various tribes from across the region, as well as some Mexican and even white prisoners. Each person had a number painted on a wooden placard hung around their neck, and their lot information was being read from a leather-bound ledger book by an auctioneer who spoke about human beings with the same casual enthusiasm he might use to describe livestock. "Lot number 17, the auctioneer was saying as Jeremiah arrived. "Female, approximately 20 years old, Lakota tribe, experienced in hide preparation, cooking, and domestic labor. Bidding starts at $50. The young woman he was describing stood with her chin raised and her back straight, despite the shackles around her wrists and ankles. She was beautiful in the way that prairie wildflowers were beautiful, natural, proud, and completely out of place in the degraded environment where she'd been forced to exist. Her traditional dress had been replaced with rough cotton clothing that was too large for her frame, but she wore it with a dignity that made the crowd of potential buyers look shabby and diminished by comparison. "Do I hear 50? The auctioneer called. $50, shouted a man near the front, a rancher Jeremiah recognized as someone who had a reputation for working his hired hands to death. 60, called another voice. 75. Jeremiah felt his hands clench into fists as he watched supposedly civilized men bid on a human being, like she was a piece of farm equipment. He looked around the crowd and saw faces he knew, respected members of the community who attended church every Sunday and talked about Christian values and American principles. "This isn't right," he said to Henry, his voice tight with controlled anger. "Mr. Stone, it's perfectly legal," Henry replied. but his voice lacked conviction. The territorial authority has oversight. Legal doesn't make it right, Jeremiah interrupted, pushing his way through the crowd toward the platform. The young woman's eyes found his as he approached, and in that moment, Jeremiah saw something that reminded him powerfully of his own daughter, who had died of fever 20 years earlier. Not physical resemblance, but the same fierce intelligence, the same refusal to be broken even when the world seemed determined to crush her spirit. "Do I hear 100? The auctioneer was saying. 125, someone shouted. And from the back, Jeremiah reached the platform and looked directly at the auctioneer, a thin man with greasy hair who held the ledger book like it was sacred scripture. "What's her name?" Jeremiah asked quietly. The auctioneer looked confused. "Her name? She's lot 17. Names aren't relevant to the transaction." "Everyone has a name," Jeremiah said, his voice carrying the authority of someone who wasn't accustomed to being argued with. "Look, mister, if you want to bid, bid. Otherwise, move along so the paying customers can conduct their business." Jeremiah looked at the young woman again, and when she met his eyes, he saw her mouth a single word: Ayanna. It was then that Jeremiah Stone made the decision that would change everything. Jeremiah reached into his vest pocket and pulled out a match, striking it against the sole of his boot with deliberate precision. The small flame danced in the Wyoming wind as he held it up for everyone to see. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" the auctioneer demanded, clutching the ledger book protectively against his chest. "Something I should have done the moment." "I saw what kind of business you're running here," Jeremiah replied, stepping onto the platform with the burning match in his hand. The crowd began to murmur nervously as they realized that the quiet rancher they'd known for 30 years was about to do something that would change everything. "Step back, Stone!" shouted Sheriff Morrison, pushing through the crowd with his hand on his gun. "This is a legal proceeding sanctioned by territorial authority." "Show me the papers," Jeremiah said calmly, not moving from his position near the auctioneer. "Show me the territorial authority that gives you the right to sell human beings like livestock." Morrison hesitated, and in that hesitation, everyone present understood that the territorial authority was nothing more than corrupt local officials who had been taking bribes to look the other way, while men like the auctioneer built a human trafficking empire in the middle of the American frontier. "The authority is implied under the territorial labor statutes," Morrison said, but his voice lacked conviction. "No statute gives you the right to chain people to posts and sell them to the highest bidder," Jeremiah replied. "And even if it did, some laws are too evil to obey." The auctioneer tried to back away from Jeremiah, but found himself trapped between the burning match and the iron posts where the prisoners were chained. "You're destroying legal property," the auctioneer protested. "I'm destroying evidence of crimes," Jeremiah corrected. "Every name in that book represents someone who was stolen from their family and sold into slavery. Every transaction recorded there is a federal crime." Ayanna watched the confrontation with growing amazement. In 2 years of captivity, she had never seen anyone challenge the system that had enslaved her. The fact that this graying rancher was willing to risk everything for people he didn't know was beyond her comprehension. Jeremiah looked directly at her again, and when he spoke, his words were meant as much for her as for the crowd. "My name is Jeremiah Stone, and I've lived in this territory for 30 years. I've seen it grow from wilderness into something that was supposed to represent the best of what America could become. But this," he gestured toward the chained prisoners, "this isn't America. This is just evil wearing the mask of law." With that, he touched the match to the corner of the ledger book. The leather cover caught fire immediately, and the auctioneer screamed as if Jeremiah had set him ablaze instead of his record book. The man dropped the burning ledger and stumbled backward, falling off the platform entirely. As the book burned, pages fluttering away like dying birds, the names and transactions of 300 human sales turned to ash and scattered in the wind. The crowd erupted in chaos. Some men shouted for Jeremiah's arrest. Others began backing away as if they didn't want to be associated with what they'd been participating in just moments before. But Jeremiah wasn't finished. He pulled a knife from his belt and began cutting the chains that bound Ayanna to the post. The metal was thick, but the knife was sharp, and years of ranch work had given him the strength to hack through the links. "What's your real name?" he asked quietly as he worked. "Ayanna Crowfeather," she replied, her voice steady despite the chaos erupting around them. "Daughter of Chief Whitehawk of the Lakota Nation." "Well, Ayanna Crowfeather, daughter of Chief Whitehawk," Jeremiah said, as the last chain fell away from her wrists. "You're not Lot 17 anymore. You're a free woman, and anyone who wants to put chains on you again will have to go through me first." Sheriff Morrison had drawn his gun and was pointing it at Jeremiah. "Stone, you're under arrest for destruction of property and interfering with legal commerce." "Whose property?" Jeremiah asked, helping Ayanna down from the platform. "Show me the bill of sale that proves anyone has the right to own another human being." Morrison couldn't answer, because no such bill of sale existed under federal law. But before the sheriff could decide whether to arrest Jeremiah or pretend the whole incident had never happened, Ayanna did something that surprised everyone, including herself. She stepped forward and spoke to the crowd in clear, precise English that carried the authority of someone born to leadership. "My name is Ayanna Crowfeather," she announced. "I am the daughter of Chief Whitehawk, and I was taken from my people 2 years ago during a raid on our winter camp. I've been held in captivity and sold 3 times since then, and I have seen dozens of my people suffer the same fate." She paused, looking directly at Sheriff Morrison. "If you arrest this man for freeing me, you become complicit in the crimes that were committed against me and against every person who was chained to these posts." Ayanna's words hung in the air like a challenge that couldn't be ignored, and Sheriff Morrison found himself facing something he'd never encountered before, a victim of the system he'd been protecting who was articulate, dignified, and completely unafraid to speak the truth about what had been done to her. The crowd began to shift uncomfortably as the full implications of what they'd been witnessing became clear. These weren't indentured servants or willing laborers. These were kidnapped, people being sold into slavery in direct violation of federal law. "You don't understand the complexities of territorial governance," Morrison said desperately, but his gun hand was shaking. "These arrangements are necessary for regional stability and economic development." "What I understand," Ayanna replied, "is that you took money to look the other way, while men like him," she pointed to the auctioneer, who was still rolling on the ground trying to extinguish the last flames from his burned ledger, "stole children from their mothers and sold them like cattle." Jeremiah stepped closer to Morrison, and when he spoke, his voice carried the quiet authority of a man who had spent decades earning respect through honest work and fair dealing. "Jim," he said, using the sheriff's first name, "I've known you for 15 years. I know you're not an evil man, but you've gotten yourself mixed up in something evil, and now you have a choice to make." Morrison's gun was still pointed at Jeremiah, but his resolve was clearly wavering. "What choice?" "You can arrest me for freeing an innocent woman from slavery and spend the rest of your life knowing you chose the wrong side of history. Or you can help me free the rest of these people and start making amends for what's been happening in your jurisdiction." As if summoned by Jeremiah's words, a commotion erupted from the crowd as several men began backing away from the platform. But they weren't retreating out of moral awakening. They were fleeing because a line of riders had appeared on the ridge overlooking the town. Ayana looked toward the horsemen and felt her heart leap with a mixture of hope and terror. "Those are Lakota warriors," she said quietly. "Probably my father's men looking for me." The crowd began to panic as they realized that what had started as a simple auction was about to become a confrontation between armed native warriors and a town full of people who had been complicit in enslaving their people. "How many?" Jeremiah asked, shading his eyes to count the riders. 30, maybe 40, Ayana replied, "and they're not here to negotiate." Sheriff Morrison finally lowered his gun, understanding that arresting Jeremiah was now the least of his problems. "What do we do?" Jeremiah looked at the 22 people still chained to the platform, then at the approaching warriors, then at the crowd of townspeople who were beginning to realize that their participation in human trafficking was about to have serious consequences. "We do what we should have done from the beginning," he said. "We free everyone on that platform, we return them to their families, and we accept responsibility for what we've allowed to happen here." "They'll kill us all," Morrison protested. "Maybe," Jeremiah agreed. "Or maybe they'll see that we're trying to make things right, and they'll give us a chance to prove we're not all monsters." Ayana stepped forward. "If you free everyone now, I'll speak to my father's warriors. I can't promise they won't seek justice for what's been done, but I can try to prevent a massacre." Jeremiah nodded and began moving along the platform, using his knife to cut the chains binding each prisoner. Other townspeople, shamed by his example and terrified by the approaching warriors, began helping with the work. As the chains fell away, the freed prisoners began to display a range of reactions. Some collapsed from relief, others maintained the stoic dignity that had carried them through their captivity, and a few began speaking rapidly in their native languages, sharing information about families and tribes. But it was a young Mexican woman, probably no more than 17, who provided the information that would change everything. "Senor," she said to Jeremiah in accented English, "this is not the only place they sell people. There are 3 more auction sites in this territory, and a main holding facility in the mountains where they keep people who don't sell quickly." Jeremiah felt his blood run cold. How many people? Maybe 200, maybe more. Men, women, children. They take them from tribes, from villages across the border, from anywhere they think no one will look for them. Ayana translated this information to the approaching warriors in Rapid Lakota, and Jeremiah could see their formation change from an attack posture to something more organized and purposeful. "They want to know if you're willing to help them find the other sites," Ayana told Jeremiah, "and if you're willing to face the consequences of what your people have done." Jeremiah looked around at the town he'd called home for 30 years, at the people he'd considered neighbors and friends, at the system of law and order he'd believed in for most of his life. "Tell them yes," he said firmly. "Tell them I'll help them find every site, free every person, and burn down this entire operation. And tell them that some of us are ready to face whatever consequences come from allowing this to happen in the first place." As Ayana translated his words, the lead warrior rode down from the ridge toward the platform. When he reached them, he dismounted and looked directly at Jeremiah with eyes that missed nothing. "I am White Hawk, chief of the Northern Lakota," he said in English. "You have freed my daughter and destroyed the records of other crimes. Why?" Jeremiah met the chief's gaze steadily. "Because it was the right thing to do. And because I've spent too many years letting other people do the wrong thing while I looked the other way." Chief Whitehawk studied him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "Then you will ride with us to the mountain holding facility. And when we are finished destroying this evil, we will discuss what justice looks like for a people who have been sold like animals in your territory." The mountain-holding facility that the young Mexican woman had described turned out to be far worse than even Jeremiah's darkest imaginings. Built into a natural cave system 30 miles north of Bitter Creek, it was a prison designed to break human spirits before the victims were transported to auction sites across 3 territories. Jeremiah rode alongside Chief Whitehawk and 40 Lakota warriors, with Ayanna serving as translator and tactical advisor. The rescue party also included Sheriff Morrison, who had chosen redemption over continued complicity, and a dozen townspeople who were determined to make amends for their participation in the trafficking operation. The entrance is heavily guarded, Ayanna explained as they crouched behind a ridge overlooking the facility. But most of the guards are hired gunmen, not true believers. If we can convince them that resistance is hopeless, they might surrender without a fight. Chief Whitehawk studied the layout through field glasses that Jeremiah had provided. How many prisoners? At least 200, replied the Mexican woman, whose name was Rosa. Maybe more. They keep families separated and move people frequently, so no one knows the full scope of the operation. Jeremiah felt sick as he absorbed the magnitude of what they were confronting. This isn't just local corruption. This is a major criminal enterprise with connections across multiple territories. Which is why we need to capture the leaders alive, Chief Whitehawk said grimly. We need them to reveal the full network before justice is done. The assault began at dawn, with Lakota warriors surrounding the facility while Jeremiah and Sheriff Morrison approached under a flag of truce. The head of the operation, a man named Colonel Marcus Reed, who claimed to be a former cavalry officer, initially tried to bluff his way out of the situation. This is a legitimate labor recruiting operation, Reed insisted as Jeremiah and Morrison stood in his makeshift office inside the cave entrance. These people have all signed contracts voluntarily. Show me the contracts, Jeremiah demanded. Reed couldn't, because no such contracts existed. The entire operation was built on kidnapping, coercion, and the systematic dehumanization of anyone deemed less valuable by the criminal network. When Reed realized that talking wouldn't save him, he reached for his gun, but found himself facing the barrel of Sheriff Morrison's pistol instead. Don't make this worse than it already is, Reed, Morrison said quietly. You're going to tell us about every auction site, every contact, every corrupt official who's been taking your money. What followed was the largest rescue operation in Wyoming Territory history. Over the next week, Jeremiah, Chief Whitehawk, and a combined force of tribal warriors and reformed lawmen systematically dismantled the entire trafficking network, freeing over 300 people and arresting dozens of criminals. But the most profound change came in the relationships forged during the crisis. Ayanna chose to stay with Jeremiah rather than immediately return to her tribe, helping him transform his ranch into a temporary sanctuary for rescued victims who needed time to heal before reuniting with their families. Why? Jeremiah asked her one evening as they watched the sunset from his porch, surrounded by the sounds of children playing and families reuniting. Because you saw me as a person when everyone else saw me as property, Ayanna replied. And because I think we can build something here that proves different peoples can live together with mutual respect. 6 months later, the former auction site in Bitter Creek had been transformed into a trading post where native tribes and white settlers conducted business as equals. Jeremiah's ranch had become a model of cross-cultural cooperation, with Lakota families working alongside white ranchers in an arrangement that benefited everyone involved. Sheriff Morrison had been re-elected after running on a platform of justice and transparency, and had hired several native deputies to ensure that tribal concerns were represented in law enforcement. The corruption trials that followed the raids resulted in prison sentences for over 50 people, including several territorial officials, who had been taking bribes to ignore the trafficking operations. But perhaps the most significant change was the relationship that developed between Jeremiah and Ayanna themselves. What had begun as a rescue had evolved into a partnership, then into something deeper that transcended the cultural boundaries that others had insisted were insurmountable. When they married in a ceremony that honored both Christian and Lakota traditions, the celebration was attended by tribal chiefs and white ranchers, former slaves and former masters, all united in the recognition that justice and love were more powerful than the prejudices that had once divided them. "You know what I remember most about that day at the auction?" Ayanna told Jeremiah during their wedding celebration. "What's that?" "The moment when you set fire to that ledger book. It wasn't just the names that burned up. It was the idea that human beings could be reduced to numbers and prices. You burned up the lie that some people are worth more than others." Years later, when historians wrote about the end of human trafficking in the Wyoming Territory, they would mark it from the day a 62-year-old rancher named Jeremiah Stone decided that some things were worth burning the world down to stop. Ledger book that once contained 300 names of enslaved people was never replaced. In its place, carved into a stone monument in the center of Bitter Creek, are the words that Ayanna spoke on the day of her rescue. "Every person has a name, and every name has value that cannot be bought or sold." The woman who had once been reduced to Lot 17 became living proof that when good people finally decide to act, even the most entrenched evil can be overcome. If this story of courage, justice, and the power of standing up for what's right moved your heart and reminded you that one person's moral courage can change everything, please subscribe to our channel and hit that notification bell. Share this story with someone who needs to remember that remaining silent in the face of injustice makes us complicit in that injustice. What's your most powerful story of someone who took a stand when it would have been easier to look the other way? Share it in the comments below. Your experience might inspire our next video. Thank you for watching, and remember, history is changed not by the many who remain silent, but by the few who refuse to accept that wrong can ever be right.